Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. Today, I wanted to talk about sacrifice. As we've been talking in these talks, we've been building up the general structure of how Peterson approaches the world. So, from truth to the logos to hierarchy and how all that seems to shape our psychology. And now we're going to start getting into actual concepts and how those concepts play into our lives. And you can kind of see the difference between what we were talking about before as maps of meaning, and now we're jumping more into the actual 12 rules for life, the actual practical aspect of Peterson's theory. Only now we can actually see where those ideas come from. But the main one I wanted to start with is sacrifice, because I think for Peterson, it's one that's, carries a lot of weight. For him, it's this huge discovery for human beings. And I want to talk about what it is, why it's still relevant, even though it's, an ancient ritual, and what it can tell us about us. And the way I want to approach this is Peterson sees this idea as one that grew with us and that morphed with us. And I'd like to kind of go down his views of the different stages of this. And then at the end, kind of explore what happens if you try to choose not to sacrifice anything in your life, and what happens if you resent those that do sacrifice in their lives. So I do want to start with some practical reasons why we want to do this. So why talk about sacrifice? Well, the first is that it can help you reassess and even restart your life if you're feeling stuck. I'm assuming 3 months locked in everyone's house, there is a lot of sense of stagnation, right? So being able to actually step out of that and find ways to break out of that can really be helpful. Additionally, it can help you understand why sacrificing even now is useful. And it's not just something that, only certain people do on Sundays. And finally, I also want to get to the realization that you don't actually have a choice. Or as Peterson would say, the only choice you have is to choose your sacrifice, but you don't actually get a choice as to whether you sacrifice something or not. And to start, I would like to go down how Peterson conceptualizes this idea coming to existence. So for the first one, as we've talked before, it's acted out. It's a subconscious or unconscious action first, and it's only till way later that we actually start to understand what's going on. He conceptualizes it as, you can imagine us as humans, or proto-humans before we evolve, realizing that there's this danger of the future. The future essentially is always causing a new problem, or always bringing a new problem. So no matter how many problems you solve, the future always brings a new threat or a new danger. And that's what he conceptualizes as the first capacity for us to actually understand time as an animal that's evolving, and being able to understand no matter what we do now, there will always be a future time that could, be worse or be different. You can conceptualize this as, if I had a time machine and I went back 1 year ago and told you, okay, in exactly 1 year, you're going to be locked in your house. You're not going to be moving anywhere. Everywhere is closed. The economy is going to be dropping by about 40 million jobs. There's going to be, mass protests due to police violence. And, there's going to be, a giant pandemic that's killing millions. About the only thing that you would believe is, yeah, okay, maybe I'll believe the protest against police violence, but that's about the only thing that was consistent or predictable before any of this, right? Everything else is a very novel thing. And that's kind of his point, that the future always holds an unknown, and we don't actually know what that is. And that's a big problem for humans when we're trying to survive in something that we know is coming. And what he notes is that at some point we did have to realize a way to solve that. And he conceptualizes it as though it's like a dream. He kind of takes the Jungian approach that dreams kind of function as a way to explore problems we don't understand. And he conceptualizes it as, imagine that we're hunting mammoths, and we've, like, a small tribe has killed a mammoth. They've all eaten and they have extra food. This is before the animal itself can actually conceptualize the future very well, so they just kind of leave it there. And then eventually they get hungry again and they realize, well, hold on, there's actually still food left. All right, well, that's an interesting pattern. And then you get into the second problem of, well, what if it's like, if they kill the mammoth, they have the food and then they use it multiple times, but then they still have extra food that will go bad before that. Well, then he kind of conceptualizes it as, well, if that's the case, it's either waste the food completely, or a couple will likely start to think, it's like, well, we can find someone else to give it to them. And, you start that first function of trading. And in doing that, what you're actually doing is it's a ritual sacrifice. You're giving it to someone else in the hopes that they'll eventually return it. It's not a transactional reward. And he notes that even new tribes, whenever they first meet, or tribes that are indigenous, they don't directly just meet and shake hands. They'll normally meet at a river or a point where they both know that they're there. And one side will leave something of value and then run away. And eventually the other side will come in, pick it up. And then if they're both like amicable, the other tribe will leave something of value and then run away, right? And slowly you start to develop this idea of like, okay, if you sacrifice for me, I'll pay it back in some way. And for Peterson, this concept, which again gets first acted out, it's not thought of, but it's an action that is essentially an adaptation to learning about the future. It's to learning that we're functioning within a timeline. For Peterson, he says we essentially conceptualize that we could bargain with reality. It's this massive change that most other animals don't seem to have, that you can forestall the delay of gratification now, and it'll magically pay off in the future, and at a time when it doesn't even exist. And the hard part about this one is that because it's action first, it's kind of hard to conceptualize. One of a good example that I was able to think about that shows this, and I think Peterson also quotes this, it's how monkeys get trapped. I don't know if you've ever seen people hunting monkeys, but one of the ways that they do it is you either get a tree, or I've also seen it with a coconut, and you essentially make a hole that's only big enough for the monkey to barely get its hand in. And then you put fruit or any bait inside that hole. And when the monkey will go in, it'll put its hand in, grab the fruit, and then it won't be able to get its hand out. And if you can find videos on YouTube where the person hunting them will then, as soon as they put their hand in, start walking towards the monkey. And the monkey will see the predator, the hunter, and just freak out and start yanking like crazy at their hand. But they won't let go of the food, right? And for Peterson, he's like, well, what does that monkey lack? The concept of sacrifice. In its psychology, it has both the drive to eat and the drive to get what it has, and the drive of survival. But they're in competition, and there's no default winner, and they don't have the capacity to let go of what they currently have for future earnings later. They don't understand that. And what Peterson notes is that this is actually what we first had to act out was what we now later in psychology terms understand as delay of gratification. And so that's what for Peterson, delay of sacrifice is where delay of gratification comes from. It's how humans learned that concept, this idea that actually if I hold back now, it'll pay off in the future. And the next step from just acting this out, it becomes represented within ritual. So this is where you start to see sacrifices to the gods and sacrifices to, a higher being. And I do want to read a real quick quote from 12 Rules, because I think he puts it much more succinctly than I could. And because I think it really talks to this point about starting to get embodied within ritual. And this is from Rule 7. It is as if something like the following happened as humanity developed. First were the endless tens of hundreds of thousands of years prior to the emergence of written history and drama. During this time, the twin practices of delay and exchange began to emerge. Slowly and painfully, they became represented in metaphorical abstractions as rituals and tales of sacrifice, told in the manner such as this. It's as if there's a powerful figure in the sky who sees all and is judging you. Giving up something of you value seems to make him happy, and you want to make him happy because all hell breaks loose if you don't. So practice sacrificing and sharing until you become an expert at it. and things will go well for you. Nobody said this, at least not plainly and directly, but it was implicit in their practice and in their stories. Action came first, as it had to, as animals we once were could act but could not think. Implicit, unrecognized value came first. People watched the successful succeed and the unsuccessful fail for thousands and thousands of years. We thought it over and drew conclusions. The successful among us delay gratification. The successful among us bargain with the future. This great idea begins to emerge, taking ever more clearly articulated form and ever more clearly articulated stories. What's the difference between a successful and the successful and the unsuccessful? The successful sacrifice. Things get better as the successful practice their sacrifices. And the questions become increasingly more precise and simultaneously broader. What is the greatest possible sacrifice? For what greatest possible good? And the answers become increasingly deeper and more profound. So for him, this practice of sacrifice kind of starts a virtuous circle that the more people sacrifice, in other words, the more they sacrifice for themselves and do good to others, the better it goes for almost everyone around them. And I wanted to find a couple of examples of just ritualistic sacrifices that most of us may not even consider sacrifices, but that's exactly what they are. One of the bigger ones I could think of was a wedding ring, right? The giant purchase and a lot of lump sum of money given for a rock that has no practical use, right? Purely the only value, the main value it holds is the fact that it's a sacrifice for a symbol of love, right? Another example is work, right? You go to work and it's a sacrifice of your time and your effort and your energy in the hopes that you'll eventually get paid with money that then gives you something else that you can do that's of value, but it's not directly given to you. And so we kind of still do a lot of these ritualistic sacrifices, but it gets even more complex because the next step is now when it gets laid out in stories. And for these, this is where you start to see, especially within the hero myth, the constant theme of the hero that sacrifices. Essentially, the hero, the biggest heroes tend to be the ones that are willing to do and we even know it as the ultimate sacrifice, right? To give your own life for the greater good, for the benefit of everyone else. And that's the archetypical hero is the person that is willing to give their lives for someone else. And also another thing of important notes, when heroes do that, when they prove to be of ultimate good, of ultimate, self-sacrifice, there's a lot of times they tend to be reborn in one way or another, or tend to live on in one way or another. That's almost always how the story concludes. And a good example of this is Jesus Christ and why his story is so archetypical. For Peterson, he points out that the strange relation for Jesus and when he dies is what that actually means. Because in him dying, he is the hero of the story. He has fully self-sacrificed himself, knowing full well that he's going to die. At the same time that he is dying, God himself, the creator of all the world, is also sacrificing his son. And also at the same time, Mary is also sacrificing her son. All three of them knew that this was how it was going to end. All three of them voluntarily choose to still have this happen, right? So it's this idea of this ultimate case of the mother, the father, and the child all choosing to sacrifice the thing they most love. And that is, for Peterson, he makes the case that is what makes the Bible story such an the Jesus Christ story, at least, such an archetypical story, because it's a limit case. You can't go past the creator of all worlds and realities losing the thing it cares about most. And finally, I also wanted to he sees this as a psychological, the last step is when we turn it to a psychological phenomena. As we've talked about before on value hierarchies and this idea that we all have We hold different values at different levels. One of the things that he noticed when we do sacrifice things, especially when we're sacrificing the thing that values most to us, it changes what is on top of our higher value hierarchy. Many of you have likely experienced this at some point if you were ever truly in love, right? It's like a true passionate love where that person is the most important thing in your life that you would do anything and everything for. And then it ends, right? And that part of you, that person that was you, that was made to prioritize your love, now has to die. And in doing that, something new has to come up. And so you essentially change what actually values, what's actually valuable in your life itself. And Peterson also points out that this also extends to society and to socialization. Essentially, as you're growing up, you have to sacrifice a part of your individuality because you have to act normal enough for everyone else to actually like you, right? Everyone here is sitting quietly and just, watching straight. No one's out there dancing because they feel like dancing or naked because they feel like being naked, right? Everyone has a general limitation of themselves that's self-imposed in an attempt to be normal. And what normal actually means is predictable enough so that I don't have to worry about you. And the I is the other person that's near you, right? And the public. And for Peterson, it's like, but that's also a restriction in and of itself. You're sacrificing everything you could be, the most eccentric parts of you, for the sake of society, of being able to live in a society. And that's kind of always the trade-off. So as you can see, from all the way from unconscious behavior to shaping of society, Peterson sees that idea of sacrifice kind of permeates through all of it. And now I'd kind of want to jump to two of his really good examples that I think are great takeaways from 12 Rules for Life, which is the story of Cain and Abel. And then after that, we'll go to the story of Peter Pan real quick and kind of talk about why both of those are very, very good examples of the dangers of messing around with sacrifice in the wrong way. So Cain and Abel, it's essentially a cautionary tale of the risk of resenting those who sacrifice more, who sacrifice just better than you, or who get rewarded better than you. For those who don't know the story, I'll give you the cliff notes. Essentially, there are two brothers who are Cain and Abel. They both love God. They're both trying to win his favor, and they're both doing sacrifices. Peterson states that in the Bible, it's slightly hinted that Cain may not be putting as much into his sacrifices as Abel is. And Abel then a lot of good things start to happen for Abel. He seems to be the ideal person. God seems to favor him a little bit more. And, this really bugs Cain. So Cain complains to God himself. And he's like, well, what's going on? I'm sacrificing and I'm doing everything I should be doing. Why ain't I getting what's due to me, right? Why does Abel seem to be able to get everything and I seem to get nothing? And God points out that it's Cain's own fault and that he's actually the one that has let sin in. And it is his responsibility and him who has caused this decay of his morals that, God himself doesn't take any responsibility for. He says, like, that's on you and your own failings. And you should take more responsibility for that. And, when the Lord of all things that exist tells you that you're the mess up, he takes it pretty hard. And as a natural reaction, he kills Abel. And Peterson, again, points out a couple of motifs that are going there. One, it's his brother, right? It's a family member that he kills. Two, it's an idol. It's the ideal thing that he should be aiming for. It is what he wants to be. And to kill the very thing that you want to be, after you do that, you're lost. You have no direction and literally no way up, right? Because that is the ideal you want to aim for. If you don't have that anymore, you have no aim. And finally, the third one is it's a revenge on God. And I think on the video that we posted, Peterson points out that it's that third part, that resentment to the level of wanting to essentially, flip the bird to God and to existence itself, to fight against existence itself because it didn't give you what you thought was owed, is the same attitude that is taken on by mass shooters and people that see life as so unjustifiable and unbearable that it shouldn't exist at all, right? And for Peterson, he's like, if you want to understand how you get to that point, you can see it in that, right? It's like the resentment towards God doesn't necessarily have to be an actual God. It simply needs to be the rules of the game are so messed up that this game shouldn't be played. And that's how you end up in that mindset, right? Of this, it shouldn't even be. And that's, he points that out as one of the risk factors for not being able to take responsibility for what you could have sacrificed to improve yourself. And then the second story I really wanted to talk about was the Peter Pan story. And this is kind of the other way. This is what I think a lot of people in the American culture specifically really struggled with. And I think it's why Peterson got a lot of support from young men, especially when he first came out. And it was the pointing out that Peter Pan, the child that never ages, right? It's also a motif that you see a lot in Jung. But the idea is that children are nothing but potential, right? When they are born, they have every single possibility. They could be anything in a way, but they aren't anything, right? They could be anything, but they aren't actually anything. They're actually just, a kid that isn't capable of doing much. And part of growing up is being able to choose a path and dedicating yourself to the path so that shapes you into something. However, that requires that you sacrifice every other potential that you could be, right? And for a lot of children, that's a huge risk, right? For a lot of children, and not just children, right? Like all of us probably know, especially nowadays, someone who, what we call fail to launch, man-child. Jung called it a child man. But someone who's still in a childlike state and hasn't taken the leap to be defined into one thing. And for Peterson, that was perfectly represented within the Peter Pan story, which is Peter Pan is a boy that never wants to grow old, and he doesn't want to grow old because the only adults around him are adults that he hates. So why would he want to become one of those? He'd rather just stay in, Neverland and be the king of the Lost Boys. Both of those names are not being a coincidence, right? And for him, if you never risk growing up and becoming anything, then you still actually choose something, but all you've chosen is to allow all the potential yous that could have been to perish. You essentially become an ill-formed or undefined person rather than any individual himself. And just to close it off, because I do think that he does a great job in talking about this, and how sacrifice can limit who you are, or not sacrificing can limit who you are. We'll start with an analysis of a truism. And he's talking about realities of life. Stark, self-evident, and understated. Sometimes things don't go well. That seems to have much to do with the terrible nature of the world, with its plagues and its famines and its tyrannies and its betrayals. But here's the rub. Sometimes, when things are not going well, it's not the world that's the cause. The cause is instead that which is currently most valued, subjectively and personally. Why? Because the world is revealed to an indeterminate degree through the template of your values. If the world you are seeing is not the world that you want, therefore it's time to re-examine your values. It's time to rid yourself of your current presuppositions. It's time to let go. It might even be time to sacrifice what you love best, so you can become who you might become instead of staying who you are. And I'll leave you with that quote.
All right. So I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm going to ask the first question because there is no question so far. So, Roger, what is sacrifice to you? How do you think of it? What's the best definition? What's the scope of the concept?
Sacrifice is willingly giving something up with no guarantee of an actual reward, either in the hopes of a reward or in the hopes of something happening. Because the weird premise here is that the sacrifice there's no guarantee that the sacrifice gets returned. That's, if anything, that's what's actually in the Cain and Abel story, is that Cain is giving sacrifices. They may not be as good as Abel's, but he is sacrificing a lot. And God, which again, the way I always think about it is God, I replace it with just reality. Reality says, no, that's not good enough. And you can't argue with, just like you can't argue with God, you can't argue with reality. It's like, no, that is not good enough. And Peterson uses the example of like the New Orleans flooding. He says, okay, it's like, whose fault was that? It's like, could you blame that on God? Or could you blame it on the fact that, our system was corrupt enough that the fundings for the levees had been ransacked to the point where we only built levees strong enough to withhold one within 100-year storm rather than one within 1,000-year storm. So like one storm that would be every 1,000 years. And the idea was, well, it's like, you can blame God if you'd like, but it doesn't solve the problem. If you blame yourself, you might actually address the issue, right? But blaming God will only lead you to resentment, and which is exactly what the story teaches, right? It's like that Cain gets so mad because God didn't give him what he thought he deserved, rather than analyzing or thinking of how he himself failed himself in a way.
So when I think of the examples that you've given, so I see two kinds of trade-offs. I mean, not sacrificing at all is tantamount to focusing on here and now, and kind of getting something here and now and focused only on that. Sacrifice seems to be a concept dealing with two things. One is over time. You're kind of looking at your future self and kind of trading with your future self. And second, you're trading across space with other people. Instead of consuming everything that you have now and enjoying it now, you're kind of passing it through other people. And by its nature, when you do that, when you do a long circuit instead of a immediate loop, there is all kinds of uncertainty involved with that. But at the same time, the payoff over a long period of time is significantly large. So it's like you're leaving something on the table now, but kind of you're actually moving it over time, moving it over space across people in order to produce a greater results for yourself and other people too.
And yeah, and that's also why Peterson sees it as this huge revelation of an idea of like, who in the world would think that that's how the world works, right? Yes. Who in the world would conceptualize the world that way? And he also points that like it's a representation of not also how reality works, but also how we interact with others and the reputation, because essentially all reputation is things you've already done defining how they should treat you now, right? That's essentially what representation is, and basically that is how it shapes the future that hasn't even come to existence yet in a beneficial way.
Wonderful. So it's going to be now Joe, Michael, David, Jay, and Ron. So when called upon to ask a question, go ahead and just unmute yourself, ask a question, and then mute yourself back. And as always, there are 4 rules. Raise your hand asking questions. And number 2, keep on topic. We're talking about sacrifice. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, be courteous. Feel free to disagree with anything. All right, Joe, go ahead.
Hello, Roger. Thank you for presenting this evening. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Do you think that this is really is this more about sacrifice, or is this about maybe seeking a balance between pleasure and pain? Because the idea that if you're seeking a pleasure that is not virtuous. You could even be seeking revenge and things along those lines. That if you're only seeking it to your end, that ultimately that would be something that's self-destructive to your, it would be self-destructive. Whereas as if you're just avoiding pain and you're actually doing it for other people and doing something for others, is that less sacrifice and more about avoiding pain than it is, say sacrifice. I don't want to repeat myself, but yeah, essentially.
Well, I think the difference is, because I think for that is just general aid, right? You don't have to, like, you can do what you're talking about, where you pursue pleasure and avoid pain without having to give anything of value, right? Like I can help, like, for example, I can help my girlfriend because she's going to do something. But the idea here, or I guess, yeah, like, I guess to some extent I get your point as to you could always make the small points, but sacrifice, at least in the way that we're using it here, tends to normally be of something of high value, right? Something that you care about, something that's hard for you to give up. That's not just an easy thing. And, some of the bigger stories is the biggest sacrifice. So, for example, in the Bible, if you see Jesus Christ as the avatar of the value of God, as in, like, that's who you should try to be, well, then what is the message that you're deriving from that story? The person that you should try to be is the person that is willing to be tortured, murdered, and put in the stake in front of everyone that loves him, to die alone, crying and doubting his own God for the sake of everyone else, right? That is what is to be embodied, right? And then that is, so like, it's beyond just the avoidance of pain, because sometimes pain is what you sacrifice, right? Like if you jump in front of a bullet, or if you get in a fight to defend someone, like, you are directly, explicitly putting yourself in the path of pain. So I do get the very similarity. I think the main difference is that the sacrifice is a relinquishment of something that is held highly valuable.
Okay, next question is from Michael. Michael A, go ahead.
Hey, Roger, thanks for leading the topic tonight.
Thanks.
Quick question. Do you think that it's possible to experience love without first experiencing sacrifice?
Ooh. No, because I think in part, I mean, I think maybe, but it wouldn't be a healthy relationship. I think most healthy relationships tend to start, because I think that's what we all seek, right? If we're actually truly going to fall in love with someone, and we're not, I mean, the weird thing about love is a lot of things can happen to you that really skew who you project that onto, or who you seek that out from. But normally I think a healthy looking for a relationship is, okay, I'm going to give some, and then I expect you to give some back. And then this dance that we do is what, it's what kind of communicates that we can work together. That's also why we kind of, like, I think even Peterson points out that, like, it's why women like dancing, right? It's like, okay, can you mimic me in a rhythmic way where me and you can be in sync and work together in this, artistic expression? It's like, all right, well, that's good. That's a decent indicator that, like, how to work with other people and can work with me. And I think that's just by nature a requirement of sacrifice, of being able to work with someone else, right?
So if you understood, yeah, I agree with that. So would you say that if you don't experience sacrifice, that everything before sacrifice is just infatuation and not love?
Yeah, I wouldn't be so absolute, because I don't think I don't think it's just like a dry cut thing. I would say that if you're trying to win someone over, the best way to do it is to, without going to the extreme one-sidedness, right? Like, is to show your willingness to sacrifice for someone else in some way. Because I think that is what almost all humans seek, is someone who's willing to, especially when needed, sacrifice at least a little bit of themselves to help you.
Okay, so next up is going to be David Edelson, then Jay, Ron, David R, Yen, and Adrian. Go ahead, David Edelson.
Hi, Roger, again. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. So the entire presentation focuses very much on the benefits of sacrifice and talking about delayed gratification. And even in crisis, saying like, this is the ultimate goal, this is the avatar, the archetype of this. I was wondering about, as you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, about this very curious situation we're in now that nobody would have predicted, with the virus and lockdown and everything else. The question is it possible to sacrifice too much, to delay gratification too much? In other words, to say, okay, I'm assuming the world's going to continue this way, and all of a sudden everybody's plans are thrown into chaos, and you could have done things earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say that's exactly why our natural default programming is to do the exact opposite of that, right? Like, I think that's why most animals and almost everyone is always living in the now. It's the recognition that there's any good at all that makes the human unique, right? Because like, I think it's quite blatantly obvious. It's like, yeah, if you just go out there and start licking, handrails, yeah, you're sacrificing, but that's not going to do you any favors, right? Like, you're not going to, there isn't something to actually gain. I think the difference is that the idea of the concept of sacrifice is that if you sacrifice something, well, it's two layers. One, if you sacrifice something, especially since we're social beings, and that something benefits others, that tends to normally, it's the idea kind of karma, essentially, right? The action brings about good action. But the second level and second layer of that is that in sacrificing, when it comes to the extreme, like I was mentioning earlier, when you sacrifice the thing you love most, something else takes its place and it creates a different value. So let's say, okay, a good example would be, right now, one of my dreams / goals is to get to grad school, right? Let's say I'm actually not nearly as smart as I think I am, and I can't, get past the GR.
I'm trading on my hopes and dreams. I'm not, but nothing's guaranteed. And the only way you wouldn't get paid from your job is if your company went bankrupt and for whatever reason. So I don't think that's a fair comparison.
Adrian?
Yeah, a couple of points. I'll try not to drag on too long, but I think it's very difficult to know if you made if you made a wrong sacrifice, except in retrospect. You can do all the things right in life, get married, have kids, and still end up alone at the end of your life, to answer William's question. And that's the case for millions of people today in virtually every Western country. I think if it's a real sacrifice, then you're sacrificing for something greater than yourself without ever expecting a payoff. And that's the really extraordinary sacrifice. And so in that sense, the sacrifice in itself is worth it. And it doesn't matter if it pays off or not.
Okay. George, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief too. I would agree with Adrian. For me, sacrifice has to be extraordinary. It's got to be something valuable. What we call sacrifice today is not sacrifice. If anything, it resembles to mild generosity. We don't sacrifice anymore. So to answer your question, what's the mistake? What we perceive to be sacrifice is not a sacrifice.
Okay. Kat, would you like to add anything?
I came to the meetup late, so I didn't really hear what the speak talk about sacrifice. But to me, the wrong sacrifice is that I guess like earlier I said about like give up argument, give up peace. Like if someone make a mistake and if a person did not say anything, like because they want to sacrifice, they don't say anything, then the other person could not understand what mistake they make. So to me, that's a wrong sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So any kind of general, now let me just open it up to any kind of general comments anybody might have. Adrian, you said you got a lot from this meetup. What did you get?
Depends how much time you're willing to give me.
I'll give you 3 minutes.
Okay. Well, one point that I found interesting, I was going to ask a question, but I guess didn't have enough time. Well, I get the feeling that Peterson wants society to look like a Norman Rockwell painting, with kind of everyone having the white picket fence and the 2.5 kids and leading very standardized lives. And I think that a case could be made that there is a social value to eccentricity and nonconformity. For example, many artists and philosophers and innovators throughout history have been eccentrics that have not conformed to the norms of their social group. I think a healthy society needs a degree of toleration for eccentricity, because it's like mutation in a biological system. You kind of need new ideas and patterns of behavior to adapt to new problems and evolve. Otherwise, you get stagnation of the social system. So, but this is also keeping in mind that eccentricity means risk, and most eccentrics don't become like Teslas and Da Vinci's, but the minority that do make it worthwhile for the rest of us, I think.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with that. And I don't know if Jordan Peterson would disagree with that. I don't know for sure, but I would certainly agree with that. And I think that is one of the greatness of America as compared to most other societies. Most other societies, whether it is Indian society or Japanese society or Chinese society or even French or Italian society, are much less tolerant to the variety. I mean, they are tolerant to certain specific variation, but nowhere near as much as American the individualism that of people pursuing their own values in their own way. I think America just takes the cake on that, and it is very powerful, it is very liberating, and human beings are very complex, and there are so many ways in which they can develop, and so many things are possible, and only such people, only when you're free to do that, you can do that. So I completely agree with you on that. So I think and on that kind of sacrifice, in the sense that, like, for example, coming from India, like India is a very traditional society where almost everything that all the decision, most of the major decisions are kind of made for you. When you become a certain age, you get married. When you become a certain age, you take a profession, and the profession, you can choose any profession as long as it is a doctor or an engineer. And then there is just a complete sequence that is planned for you, and any kind of eccentricity. I think the culture is lesser. It is more limited as a result of that. So yeah. Anybody else wants to bring up anything? Chachi.
I just want to say that I think, when I think of the sacrifices that I've made in the past and the ones that I'm currently thinking about, I really think that the biggest thing I struggle with in terms of sacrifice is certainty. I feel as though whenever I have to be certain about something, I struggle. Or whenever I hear somebody certain, I struggle to believe it. And I just feel like that's become my biggest obstacle. Is it enough? I'm not certain. It's like doubt, that whole doubt thing, and struggling with that, I think, and coming to terms with whether whatever the sacrifice is right or enough, is being certain about it, the struggle.
Okay. I think, George, you had a point.
I just want to respond to what you said, Shrinkat, regarding living in a culture that has these cultural algorithms, be a doctor, be this, be that. I think there are some sort of, like, perhaps implicit sacrifices or unconscious sacrifice that occurs, that if I live within a cultural milieu that tells me be A, B, C, D, but individually, none of them really resonate with me, but I subscribe to those things. I think there's an unconscious sacrifice that the individual is going to. It may not be an intentional sacrifice, but existentially, it mimics a sacrifice. You're becoming what your culture expects, but you're not becoming what your subjective endowment. that I would claim that's a form of sacrifice.
Okay, very, very good. Okay, I'm going to give a notice for people to come back into the main room, and we will say 2 minutes. Okay. All right. Anybody for any? So welcome, Daoud and Joan. We were discussing sacrifice today, and what we'll be doing is that in a couple of minutes we'll be going back to main room, and you'll get to hear what everybody learned from this meetup. So you have optimized your time. You're going to get takeaways from everybody of what they got from this meetup. But let me ask one question to each of you while we have a minute. What does sacrifice mean to you? What does the concept mean to you? Joan?
Well, it means giving up something important. I think as somebody else said, hopefully to gain something greater.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Daoud, what about you?
I think it's for me, it's something giving something to another person, which is important for you, and another person has a need of that thing.
Okay.
Like
very good.
That thing.
Okay. So I'm going to now close this so that we can go back to the main room and get everybody's takeaways. Okay, everybody's coming back. Let me just make sure. Okay, everybody will be back in about 15 seconds. 8, 7, 6, 4, 2, 1. All right, so everybody's back. Welcome back, everybody. Let me see, where is Roger? I don't see Roger.
Right here. Sorry.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay, so folks, time for takeaways. This is the format that we've used in our in-person meetup. So what we do is that we present an idea, we go into small groups, we discuss 3 questions connected with the idea, and then we come back and you have about 2 minutes and you can talk about what were your takeaways. If after that, if you anybody who wants to continue to the breakout rooms, I will set up the breakout rooms again. But normally, and that parallels our time where we used to go to Starbucks after that. So people could do kind of much more free flow discussion. But this is the last part of it. You know, what are the takeaways? What did you learn from this entire experience? So I'm just going to go in the order in which I see people on the screen here, which is going to be different for everybody. So let's start with Sean. Sean, what did you get from the meetup? You can talk for about 2 minutes. Go ahead.
I would actually like to pass if that's possible. Thanks.
That's fine. That's fine. Ron, what did you get from the meetup?
Sorry to also pass, but
okay.
Not.
Becky, what about you?
I think we're discussing incorporating the thresholds of what we put on the table for sacrificing as part of the definition.
Okay. Adrian, what did you get?
Yeah, I got, well, the main lesson for me is to educate myself on Peterson a little bit more because I don't know too much about him. But for me, it's really that how kind of mythology plays into evolutionary biology in a way, and how concepts like sacrifice, I'm not saying this is true for everyone, but how Peterson ties it back to a kind of a Darwinian framework where everything is kind of perceived through that lens is interesting, but I think ultimately a little bit too reductive. Yeah.
Okay. Kat, what about you? Kat? Okay, go ahead, Kat.
I would like to skip.
Okay. If folks, if you want to skip, you can just type skip in the chat, then I will not call on you. Next one up is CP Rao.
Good evening, everyone. I think the way I see that, my takeaway is that sacrifice is a part of the life. There is an opportunity to sacrifice in everything we do in every day. It's just a matter of realizing and having the concept in the mind and see what we can sacrifice it in everything you do.
Okay. John.
Well, I think it gave me a chance to stir around with a topic that I haven't given a lot of thought to lately. And I've never been familiar with Jordan Peterson, so all this is an introduction to me. And it might be something that I might have fun exploring further. I'm not, where I go is I want to dismiss the idea of sacrifice apart from anything having to do with risk and reward and expectation. And my own personal notion of sacrifice is when you speak out, when you assert yourself, when you bravely exercise a gesture of some kind and not expect anything back. But somehow, I think if you do that right, with the right intentionality and the right kind of emotion, and you pay attention, that you can get a response almost